In this episode, you're going to learn about two 19th century weapons that completely changed the face of war. A ton of stuff was introduced in the 1800s, but this week I'm going to be talking about the Gatling gun and an ironclad ship called the CSS Neuse. Hey guys, and welcome to episode 78. This is the NC Everything podcast, and this is the show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. Thank you for choosing me to listen to for the next little bit, and if you're watching instead of listening, thank you for choosing me to listen to. If this is one of your first episodes, well, you're pretty lucky because I got a pretty good one here. But first, I want to thank all of you for listening and subscribing. And if you went over to the YouTube channel and listened and subscribed there, or watched and subscribed, a really big thank you. That's kind of a startup. I don't have a lot of content there yet, so really thank you for going over there and supporting that part of the NC Everything podcast. That little bit of effort gives me a huge boost in confidence, and it makes it worth sitting here talking to myself for several hours. And I realize the show's, anywhere from 15 to 35, 40 minutes long. But it takes me, I'm guessing, about 7 or 8 hours to put together an episode. And it's probably actually going to be a little bit longer now that I've added the YouTube part of it. But I'm hoping with practice I don't have to spend as much time editing the YouTube video. Although it does add a little bit of edge to it that you can see me rather than just hear me now. So I'm working through that mess. Now, if you're looking for something to do while you're listening to this episode, you can head over to www.thencEverythingpodcast.com. That's the official website of the NC Everything Podcast, and there you can check out all the content. I have a little write-up about myself and the show. I have the show notes that include links to my sources and links to the pictures, and there's the photo gallery. Now, that's not links to pictures. That's pictures I've actually taken myself. I add to it whenever I can, so you can check that out. And if you hadn't checked out the YouTube channel yet, I did add a link on the home screen to the YouTube channel for the NC Everything podcast, so you can click it right there at the top of the screen. Now let's go ahead and get into the content. Like I said, today I'm going to be talking about the Gatling gun and the CSS Neuse. And both of those subjects are listener suggestions. They came in from Rip from Smithfield. Now, if you've been following the show for a while, you've probably heard Rip's name come up a few times for suggestions. Last year, Rip, he sent me an email with a long list of suggestions on there, what I'd consider a long list. And it's definitely been keeping me busy, but I've really enjoyed going through this list, and I still have several to go. Now, if you have an idea for an episode, there's a contact button on the website, and I'll leave a link for contacting me in the show notes. Alright, so let's get into it. This entire episode takes place during the Civil War, and a lot of you who know me know I love talking about the Civil War, so this was a real joy of a show to put together. Now, the Civil War era, and actually most of the 19th century, was a really interesting time in the world. I mean, during that time, we're right in the middle of an industrial revolution, and bam, a Civil War breaks out. So now lines have been drawn, and thousands of men are fighting for something they fiercely believe in. And with the outbreak of the Civil War, suddenly the same innovative minds that came up with stuff like the telegraph, the sewing machine, the cotton gin, and the elevator are now coming up with hot air observation balloons, double-barreled cannons, repeating rifles and landmines, and of course, ironclads and machine guns. I mean, did you know that before the Civil War there was no pre-hospital care is what we call it? There was no field hospitals or field medics. If you got hurt on a battlefield, you were put on a wagon and a horse, you were taken to the nearest town, the nearest hospital, and there you'd be worked on if you survived the trip. But during the Civil War, they figured out that they can amputate your leg, they can give you some kind of medical care right there on the battlefield, and you'd still be out of the battle, but it would save your life. But it was the brutality of the Civil War that completely changed the way everybody thought pretty much about everything in our country. And that brutality was about to get a whole lot worse. So let's talk about Richard Gatling. Now, I'm probably going to say Gatling a lot through this episode. It was Gatling, I-N-G. I'm just in the habit of saying Gatling. Richard Gatling was born on September 12, 1818, in the Maney's Neck community of Hertford County. Now, this is in the northeast part of North Carolina, and Maney's Neck is pretty much right on the Virginia line. Richard Gatling's dad was a slave-owning planter who owned about 1,000 acres. So as you can see, he didn't come from too humble of beginnings with a 1,000-acre farm, bunch of slaves. But also, his dad was an inventor. In fact, his dad held several patents for farm machinery that he had invented. Richard's brother, James, was a bit of an innovative soul too. But his interest was in manned flight. And he spent several years working on what he called his aeroplane. In fact, he did build a model and fly it, but it crashed and it gave him a broken leg. There's an interesting story behind him, and you can hear that story in episode 25 of this show where I talk about aviation in North Carolina. So Richard Gatling grew up with that innovative spirit all around him. As far as formal education, he went to a local school for a short time called Buckhorn. After that, he became a schoolmaster. Well, then he gives that up to open a country store near the town of Winton. Now, it was during this time that he got his first idea. He was up visiting Norfolk, Virginia, and one day he's out watching an experimental steamboat. Now, if you look at a steamboat, the way they propel themselves, it's a wheel paddle in the back of it. Think of the riverboats or like Tom Sawyer. Anyway, he's watching these wheel paddles go, and he gets an idea. He imagines this screw-type propeller, and I guess you can imagine that. He imagined this screw-type propeller rather than the wheels, because the wheels are kind of slow and cumbersome. So he goes to his dad and tells him, hey, I got this idea. Can I go to Washington and get this patent? And his dad says, no, you should forget about that idea. I'm not sure why that was, but 7 months later, his dad changed his mind, and Richard Gatling heads to Washington to get his first patent. When he gets to Washington, he finds out that the screw-type propeller had already been patented just a few days earlier by a man named John Ericsson. Now, John Ericsson was a Scandinavian inventor. He went on to patent ideas that would lead to the invention of ironclad warships, which is really ironic. I didn't know this when I started researching for this episode, but ironclads are the second part of this episode, so it's really weird how that kind of tied in. All right, back to Richard Gatling. In 1844, he finally receives his first patent. He develops this rice seed planter, and he got his patent for it. And after this, he left North Carolina and went on the road to market this rice seed planter. Now, he ends up in St. Louis, where he converts this rice planter into a wheat planter. And after this, he made a fortune. But then he ran into some terrible misfortune. In the winter of 1845, he was on a business trip, and he caught smallpox. What made it worse was that this wasn't just a normal business trip. He was on a riverboat, and it was wintertime, and the riverboat got stuck in the ice for several weeks. So now he's got smallpox. It's wintertime. He's stuck in the ice. He can't get any medical help because the ship can't go anywhere. But eventually, he does recover, and he makes it out okay. But now he has another idea. He wants to study medicine, but he has no intention of becoming a doctor. He wants to study medicine just so he can help his friends and his family out in case they ever get in any kind of medical trouble. And that goes to show you he does have a compassionate spirit. In fact, several things he worked on in his life was really just to help somebody else, like the rice planter and the wheat planter. So he decides to study medicine, and from there, he goes to Indiana Medical College and Ohio Medical College, and he gets his diploma in 1850. Now from here, he went to Indianapolis, where he actually did study medicine for a little bit. And while he's in Indiana, he develops a machine that breaks up hemp. By the way, I just learned on a podcast the other day, and some of you may know this already, but I just learned on a podcast the other day that hemp and marijuana are the exact same plant. I had no idea. I thought they were completely different. I thought they were in the same family, but different plants. But apparently, hemp and marijuana are the same plant. But the THC is what makes the difference. So when you take a cannabis plant If the THC is less than 3%, it's hemp. If it's more than 3%, it's marijuana. Now, I'm not much of a cannabis connoisseur, but I did find that incredibly fascinating. Anyway, back to Gatling. Not long after he invented his hemp breaking up machine, he invented a steam plow, and he got a patent for it. Now let's fast forward to April 12th, 1861. This is the day the Confederate troops fired their first shots of the Civil War when they bombarded Fort Sumter, South Carolina. Now, the war hadn't been going on very long when one day Richard Gatling was down by the train tracks or the train depot, and he saw the trains bringing the dead and the wounded in from the battlefields, and he was horrified. But this got his wheels turning again. So he started kind of running the numbers and looking at these guys. He found out that only 3 out of every 8 men died of bullet wounds or battle wounds. The rest died from sickness. So he was thinking, if he could come out with a higher capacity weapon that could fire more rounds, it would take less men to use this weapon, and less men shooting guns meant less men getting shot or dying from disease. Also, if this is a high capacity weapon, it might be big and it might be scary, and it might deter people from fighting in the first place. Now, I know this sounds backwards, but that's the way Richard Gatling thought. His plan wasn't to kill more people, it was to require less people to be killed, if that makes any sense. Now, what we know now that Richard Gatling didn't know back then was that generals were going to send all the men they had, regardless of what kind of hell they were sending their men into. Richard Gatling works on this idea for a while, and eventually he comes out with a weapon that we now know as the Gatling gun. Now, this Gatling gun was 10 rifle barrels all grouped together in a central rotating shaft, and that shaft was moved by a crank. Now, the bullets would automatically drop into the barrels, and then the hammers that fire the bullets would continuously hammer these things out. Now, I don't know if my description of the Gatling gun was any good, but the Gatling gun appears in several movies. 2 of my favorites are the Lone Ranger, right there at the beginning of the climax, and The Last Samurai during the beginning of the finale. Also, the gun that the Terminator shoots all the cop cars with in Terminator 2, that's a version of the Gatling gun. Now, the first Gatling gun that he had come up with, the first idea, although he probably wasn't calling it Gatling gun at that time, it was tested and patented in 1862, and England couldn't wait to get their hands on one. Now, this original Gatling gun could fire 200 rounds per minute. Now, I'd like to take a second to put this firing rate of 200 rounds per minute into perspective. A seasoned soldier, back then, could fire a Springfield Model 1861 rifle 3 times per minute. Now, remember, these are muzzle loaders. You have to pack the bullet in there and everything. 3 times per minute. That was the firing rate for a really good soldier. Now, this first model of the Gatling gun can fire 200 rounds per minute. That means that you would need 60 or 70 men to keep up with the firing round of one Gatling gun. Can you even imagine what it was like the first time these guys ran into this thing? I mean, there wasn't any Facebook back then. There wasn't world news. Most likely, not many people knew that this Gatling gun was even a thing. So they go out on the battlefield. The battle starts. They fire their first rounds. They're cleaning out the barrel. They're getting ready to reload. And then they hear that sound of the Gatling gun. It must have been terrifying. Now, even though this first model was out, Richard Gatling was still trying to improve on the Gatling gun. Now, he did improve the Gatling gun and increase the firing rate, but I couldn't figure out what the firing rate of this improved version was. But he did go on to sell 12 models of that improved one. Now, later, he built a model that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, and he also experimented with a model that could fire 3,000 rounds per minute. Now, eventually, of course, the U.S. adopted these things, but the Gatling gun was used all over Europe. It's said that every country except Belgium adopted the Gatling gun. Now, in 1870, Richard Gatling sells the patent for the Gatling gun to Colt Arms. And that's the end of the Gatling gun story. As far as Richard Gatling's personal life, he got married in 1854 and he had 4 children. And in 1902, he dies in New York City and he was buried in Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, Indiana. In 1911, after 45 years of service, the Gatling gun was declared obsolete and retired from service. Now today, the closest thing to a Gatling gun is an M134 cannon. Now this is a 6-barreled, air-cooled machine gun, and it's used on aircraft, and it can fire 6,000 rounds per minute. That's 100 shots per second. Now, remember, like I said, that during the Civil War, a seasoned soldier could fire 3 rounds per minute. That means it would take over 30 minutes for a Springfield-modeled 1861 rifle to fire what an M134 could fire in 1 second. Now, I actually looked this thing up on YouTube, and it's insane to watch this thing fire. I would definitely recommend it. I might have a link to it in the show notes. We'll see if I can get that. And now let's move on to the second part of this episode. Now I'm going to be talking about what they call ironclads. Now, the ironclad is another innovation that got its popularity during the Civil War. And it's called an ironclad because it's literally a wooden boat that's clad in iron. Now, the ironclad shouldn't be confused with a submarine. A submarine is made out of metal, and it goes completely underwater. An ironclad floats on the surface of the water, just like a regular ship, and the iron doesn't even cover the hole under the water. The iron begins just under the water surface, and then it covers the whole part of the boat that's outside of the water. Now, submarines were being tested back then. You can look up the story of the Hunley. It was actually a tragic disaster. But submarines are a whole different beast. Here we're just talking about ironclads. Now, ironclads had several different names. The ironclad is the most common name, but they also had other names. Armorclads, iron gophers, iron coffins, which sounds horrible, and turtlebacks, because they did float on the surface like a turtle. But I'll tell you, I love the name Iron Gopher. It sounds awesome, an iron gopher. Now, people had been making attempts at armoring a ship for a long, long time. The problem is that back in the day, ships used wind power or oars to move. And so if you put a bunch of iron on this ship, it's going to be really hard to row, and the wind ain't going to move it very much. Then, if it did come under attack, it wasn't going to be able to escape very quickly. But then in the late 1800s, steam engines became a thing, and with steam came more power and more speed. Now we're back at 1861 again. You got the Union versus the Confederacy. Well, the Union was pumping out warships. They had plenty of them to start with anyway. The Confederacy, they really couldn't compete with the number of ships that the Union had. So they had an idea. What if they built a handful of severely deadly ships that couldn't be beat to compete with the entire Union Navy? So they would dig this armored ship idea back out and give that a try. And they could call them ironclads, or even better, iron gophers. So the first attempt at an ironclad for the Confederacy was called the CSS Virginia, and it was a frigate that was converted into an ironclad ship. Well, it turns out that it was really slow, like you would guess, and it couldn't go into shallow water because it displaced too much, so it had to stay out in the deeper ocean. But on March of 1862 at Hampton Roads, Virginia, it took down 2 Union ships on the first day. Now, the goal was to destroy the entire Union blockade, but there was a problem. The Union had their very own iron gopher, and it showed up on day 2. It was named the Monitor, and so on day 2, the Virginia and the Monitor went head-to-head. And eventually, they called a draw, but this changed the face of naval warfare forever. Now, let's bring it on home to North Carolina. After both sides figured out that these ironclad ships did work, kind of, everybody was clamoring to get one. Now, between 1862 and 1865, over a dozen ironclad ships had begun to be built in North Carolina, but not many of them made it through because the North Carolina coast was being occupied by Union forces at that time, or most of it, not all of it, but most of it. But 4 ironclads were completed during that time. This was the North Carolina and the Raleigh, which were both built at Wilmington. Then the Neuse was started at Whitehall and finished in Kinston, and the Albemarle was started at Edwards Ferry, and it was finished in Halifax. Now, the reason some of these ironclads started in one place and were finished somewhere else was because they would build the wooden boat or the wooden ship part of it in one place, and then it would go to another place to get its engine, its armor, and all its guns. And that's because this stuff was heavy and it had to be lowered down onto the ship with hoists. So they could build the ship part of it literally in the woods. It would need some machinery to finish the construction. Now, let's talk about the CSS Neuse. The plan for the Neuse was that it would meet up with the Albemarle and it would retake the Carolina coast from the Union. It was designed by naval contractor John L. Porter, and it would be built by a company called Howard and Ellis Shipbuilders out of New Bern. Now, it was built in a town called Whitehall. Today, that town is called Seven Springs. Now, the Albemarle was the sister ship to the Neuse, and at the same time the Neuse was being built, the Albemarle was being built on the Roanoke River. The biggest danger to building these ironclad ships was Union raids. Because, like I said, the Union had captured most of the Carolina coast. So every once in a while, they would send raids inland. And these raids, if you were building a ship, if they found you, you were going to get killed. And that's exactly what happened. On December 11th, 1862, General John Foster left New Bern with troops to do an inland raid. Now, they were heading for Goldsboro, but they got to Kinston first on December 14th. In Kinston, the troops were engaged by the Confederates, and by the end of that battle, the Confederates retreated to Whitehall. The problem was they were leading the Union straight toward the construction of the Neuse in Whitehall. Now, the Neuse was being built on the north bank of the Neuse River. Well, the Federals, the Union troops, were heading down the south bank of the Neuse River. When they got close to the construction site, they saw all these barrels of rosin and turpentine everywhere, because that's what they were using to build the ship. About the time the Union saw the Confederates saw the Union. Well, there's a bridge going across there. So the Confederates grab all these barrels of turpentine and rosin, they throw it on the bridge, and they light it on fire. The bridge goes up in flames, and it falls into the river. Well, of course, the Union said, "We got to destroy that ship." Well, they had a tough time trying to do this, because the whole time they're trying to get over here to this ship and shoot at it, the Confederates are hiding in the woods and they're shooting back. So Union troops, they took all these barrels of rosin and turpentine on their side of the river, and they piled them up and lit it on fire. And it must have been an inferno, because I read that it was 2,000 barrels that they lit up. Well, when this blaze went up, it lit up the whole sky and all the woods, and they could see exactly where all these Confederates were hiding, and so they opened fire. Then they started looking for volunteers for somebody to swim across the river and light this ship on fire. A guy named Private Butler, he volunteered to go. So he swims across, and he grabs up a piece of burning wood from that bridge that they set on fire, and he starts heading for this ship. But the Confederates come after him, and he jumps in the river and swims back to safety. Well, the Union, they continued to fire at this ship all through the night, and the next day, they felt like they had destroyed this ship. They assumed they did anyway, and so on December 17th, they continued their trip to Goldsboro. But it turns out they didn't really damage the Neuse at all. They delayed work, but it was fine. And in 1863, the CSS Neuse was ready, or the ship part of it was done anyway. From here, it goes to Kinston, where it was going to get its iron plating, its engine, and all of its guns. Now, when it got to Kinston, they moored the Neuse in a spot they called the Cat Hole. Now, I don't know why they called it the Cat Hole, but I do know growing up, there was a spot where we caught a bunch of catfish down by the lake, and we called it the Catfish Hole. So I don't know if that's why or not, but the Neuse stayed in the Cat Hole through the fall and the winter of 1863. Now, in January of 1864, General Lee sends General Davis a letter, and he says, "If you want to try to take New Bern, I can spare some troops, but I'm going to need them back for the spring." And that's because it was winter and there wasn't a whole lot going on. But General Lee tells Davis, "I'm going to need my men back in the spring to continue to fight up here." Well, Jefferson Davis tells Lee that these ironclads, the Neuse and the Albemarle, they're not ready. If they try to take New Bern, it's probably going to fail. And the thing was that there was delay after delay. There were supply issues. They couldn't keep good help to help build this ship. So it was being delayed all the time. But regardless of that, Lee does send some men down, and they do attack New Bern, and they fail. But then on April 22nd, 1864, the Neuse is finally ready to fight, and so it leaves the cat hole. However, a half a mile downstream, it got stuck on a sandbar. Now P.G.T. Beauregard comes into the story. Now, if you don't know who P.G.T. Beauregard is, he's pretty much the man who started the Civil War. He was the general in charge of bombarding Fort Sumter, which started the Civil War. Also, I've been to his grave in Metairie Cemetery, which is just outside New Orleans. And if you ever get down that way, Metairie Cemetery is beautiful. And I know that sounds weird, but it's all these intricate mausoleums. And you've probably seen pictures of New Orleans cemeteries. There's a bunch of them. I would definitely recommend Metairie. But I've stood outside the mausoleum where Beauregard lies. And I may, since I brought it up, I may link some pictures to Metairie Cemetery in the show notes, so check that out. Anyway, they just recently created the Department of North Carolina, and Beauregard is in charge of it. So he's told that the Neuse is stuck in the mud. And he really doesn't care because he doesn't have a whole lot of faith in ironclads anyway. He thinks they're heavy, slow, and he thinks they're death traps. And he's kind of old school, you know how some people resist change. Beauregard really doesn't want to hear much about these ironclads. But he does get a hold of General Bragg and asks him to send an engineer to see what he can do about this Neuse stuck in the mud. The engineer comes down, he looks at the situation, and he says this is probably going to be a while because the spring rains have already came in, and even with the spring rains, the water didn't rise enough to get the Neuse free. So it's going to be stuck for a long time, he thinks. But as luck would have it, rain did come in May, and the Neuse floated. But it didn't continue down toward New Bern. By this time, it just decided to head straight back to the cat hole. And this was because, again, it's springtime. The men that General Lee had sent had already returned to Virginia, so trying to attack New Bern now would really be useless. Also, the river was still pretty low, and they didn't want to risk getting the Neuse stuck in the mud again. Now, by November of that year, the waters had risen, and they were certainly high enough for the Neuse to make an attack if it wanted to. However, there just wasn't enough troops to put this together. Now, the next year, 1865, in the middle of January, Fort Fisher was captured by Union forces, and these Union troops were about ready to head to Wilmington. Well, General Lee sends men to Wilmington to help protect it, but on February 22nd, Wilmington was captured. 2 weeks after that, Union troops are getting ready to head to Goldsboro. The plan was that they would link up with Sherman on his march to the sea. Well, he's already marched to the sea, now he's heading north. So these troops would meet up with Sherman in Goldsboro, and they would head north from there. So on March 6th, 13,000 Union troops left New Bern, headed for Goldsboro. Well, about 3 miles outside of Kinston, they were engaged by Confederate forces. Now, by this time, Beauregard wasn't in charge of the Department of North Carolina anymore. General Braxton Bragg was. He could see the war was coming to an end, and so he ordered the Neuse to be destroyed. So on the morning of March 12th, the crew of the Neuse fired some shells at the advancing Union Army, and then they set the Neuse on fire. And these were the only shots ever fired by the Neuse during the whole Civil War. Now, as the Neuse burned, a loaded gun inside the ship caught on fire and exploded, and it blew a hole in the side of the ship, and it sunk pretty quickly. After the war, some of the iron and the guns were salvaged from the ship, but it sat on the bottom of the Neuse River until 1961. Now, on October 27th, 1961, Henry Casey, Lemuel Houston, and Thomas Carlyle began an operation to try to salvage the Neuse. Now, I'm sure they were curious and interested, but the fact that there were rumors that there might be gold on the Neuse probably didn't hurt their motivations. Now, the project started out pretty easy because the river was low, and a lot of curious bystanders were helping out, and they were offering money. So they had all the help and all the finances they needed to try to get this Neuse out of the river. But 2 years into the project, low water levels exposing the ship to air and high water levels just banging the crap out of the ship, it was starting to get destroyed. So in May of 1963, they hired a house mover named D.C. Murray, and he was going to move the noose out of the river. And Governor Terry Stanford, he gave $10,000 to the project. So in order to move the noose, they had to cut it into 3 sections. And they finished moving it in 1964. The noose was placed at Caswell Memorial Park, and then that area was named the CSS Neuse Historic Site. Today, what's left of the noose can be found in a museum in Kinston. And that's pretty much the end of ironclads. They weren't used after the Civil War. I think ultimately they were deemed a failure, but they had some successes during the war. But like I said, they were experimenting with submarines, and that was going to be the new armored ship of the future. And that's all I have, guys. A gun that could kill thousands, and a gunship that probably didn't kill a single person. Now, if you enjoyed the episode, hit the subscribe button and give me a rate and review, because that's what helps people find the show. And don't forget, you can go to www.thenceverythingpodcast.com and listen to all my past episodes. And if you have an idea, you can hit the contact button. You can also follow the show on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. Although Facebook is where I'm putting most of my stuff. And that's the NC Everything podcast this week, so I'll talk to you next time.